This wedding will stop right now.
There is a moment, and most of us will never forget ours, when the life we thought we understood turns inside out. It does not always arrive with sirens or thunder. Sometimes it arrives on a Saturday morning in a church full of white roses, with organ music playing softly in the background and 200 people dressed in their finest, holding programs with a photo of a couple they all believed in. Sometimes, the moment that changes everything is quiet. It walks in through a side door. It sits in the very last pew. It folds its hands in its lap and it waits. And this is the story of one of those moments. This is the story of a woman who waited 27 years to say the only 4 words that could save her son's life. And the tragedy, the real tragedy, is that she almost didn't say them at all. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Margaret Louise Carter, born the 3rd of 5 children in a working-class neighborhood on the east side of Baltimore, Maryland, in the fall of 1964. Her father, Raymond Carter, worked the overnight shift at a steel plant for 31 years. Her mother, Gloria, cleaned offices downtown before the sun came up and was always home by the time Margaret and her siblings got off the school bus. They were not a wealthy family. They were not a family that vacationed or owned 2 cars or ate out on weeknights. But they were a family that understood the meaning of keeping your word. Raymond Carter used to say it at the dinner table, not as a lecture, not as a lesson, just as a fact of life, the way you would state the weather. He would say, your name is all you have when everything else is gone. Your name and your word. And the 2 things are the same. Margaret grew up believing that with every part of herself. She believed it so completely that when the moment came, the moment that would test everything her father had ever taught her, she chose her word over her own happiness without a second thought, and it cost her more than most people will ever understand. She was 23 years old when she met Daniel Whitmore, and she was working as a registered nurse at Johns Hopkins Hospital, just 2 years out of school, still learning the weight of the world that a hospital carries inside its walls. Daniel was not a patient. He was the kind of man who visited patients, the kind who showed up with expensive flowers and a warm handshake for every nurse at the station and a confidence that filled a room the way sunlight fills a room, all at once and completely. He was in real estate development, and already successful at 31. The kind of success that wears itself quietly in the quality of a watch and the cut of a coat. Margaret noticed him the way you notice someone who does not quite fit the space they are standing in, not because he was out of place, but because he was too present, too deliberate. Like a man who had decided somewhere along the way that every room he walked into was a room he would own before he left it. And he asked for her number 3 weeks after they first spoke. She said no. He came back the following Tuesday with coffee and a question about a novel he had seen her reading in the break room. She said no again. The 3rd time, he did not ask for anything. He just sat down across from her in the hospital cafeteria during her lunch break and said he had 20 minutes and he would like to spend them talking to someone who clearly was not interested in impressing him. Now Margaret laughed in spite of herself, and that was that. For the first 4 months, she told herself it was casual. She told herself she was being careful, being smart, being the kind of woman her mother raised her to be. But the truth she would spend the rest of her life turning over like a stone, is that she fell fast, and she fell hard, and she fell in the way that only happens when you are young enough to believe that love is a thing that announces itself honestly. And they went to dinner. They drove to Annapolis on a Sunday afternoon and walked along the water. He remembered things she mentioned once, the name of her favorite author, the coffee shop on Charles Street she loved, the fact that her father's birthday was in October. He made her feel seen in the way that very few people ever make you feel seen. And for 11 months that felt in the way that certain seasons feel. longer and richer than their actual length. Margaret Carter believed she had found the person she was going to spend her life with. She found out the truth on a Wednesday evening in March. She had called his cell phone twice and gotten no answer. She called the office number he had given her, and a woman picked up. Not a receptionist, not a colleague. The kind of pause on the other end of the line that tells you everything before a single word is spoken. The woman said, in a voice that was somehow both careful and completely undone, that this was Daniel Whitmore's home. And could she ask who was calling? Margaret hung up. She sat on the edge of her bed for what she later described as the longest hour of her life. And when Daniel called her back 40 minutes later, she did not ask questions. She just said, "Tell me the truth. All of it. Right now." And to his credit, if you can call it credit, he did. He was married. Had been for 6 years. His wife's name was Patricia. They had 2 daughters, 8 and 5. They lived in a 4-bedroom house in Ellicott City. Patricia was a teacher. She coached her daughter's soccer team on Saturdays. Daniel had, by his own account, never done anything like this before. He was sorry. He was deeply sorry. He did not have an explanation that was good enough. He knew that. He just needed her to know he was sorry. Margaret put the phone down. She sat on the kitchen floor. Not the bed, not the couch, but the floor, the way you sit when you need to feel something solid beneath you because everything else has gone sideways. And she stayed there for 2 hours. She did not cry right away. The crying came later, in waves, over the weeks that followed. What came first was something colder and quieter. It was the feeling of understanding, all at once, that the story she had been living was not the story she thought it was. That every memory she had been collecting and holding carefully, like something precious, had been built on a foundation that was never there. She found out she was pregnant 5 weeks later. This is the part of the story where some people will say they know what Margaret should have done. People always know what someone else should have done when they are standing far enough away from the fire not to feel it. The truth is that Margaret did not know what to do. She was 23 years old, 4 months along in a pregnancy she had not planned. In love with a married man she would never speak to again, and the daughter of a woman who had spent her life making other people's special days possible from the back of a building before sunrise. She had no roadmap for this. She had only herself, and her word, and the belief, the stubborn, aching, inconvenient belief, that the choices you make in your lowest moments are the ones that define everything that comes after. She made a decision that very few people would have made. Not because she was afraid, not because she was ashamed. She made it because she looked at the situation with the kind of clear-eyed honesty that grief sometimes gives you. And she asked herself one question. What kind of life would this child have? Torn between 2 households. Introduced to Patricia's daughters as a half-sibling nobody asked for. Used as evidence in arguments. Growing up knowing he arrived in the world as the consequence of someone else's choice to lie. Margaret decided her son, and she knew somehow from the very beginning that it would be a son, would not carry that. He would not wear that. He would grow up with his mother's name and his mother's values and a life that was entirely his own, built on solid ground. She called Daniel once more. She told him what she had decided. She told him she was keeping the baby. She told him she would raise the child alone. She would never contact him. She would never name him in any legal document without his consent, and she would tell the child only what was necessary, that his father was someone who could not stay, and that it had nothing to do with him. In return, she asked for one thing, a trust account. Not for herself. She made that absolutely clear, for the child. A reasonable amount set aside so that if anything ever happened to her, her son would be taken care of. Daniel agreed without negotiation. He sent the first deposit within 2 weeks. After that, He was gone from her life as completely as if he had never been in it at all. On a Tuesday morning in August 1990 at Johns Hopkins Hospital, the same building where she had first seen Daniel Whitmore walk down a corridor with expensive flowers and a room-filling confidence, Margaret Louise Carter gave birth to a son. She named him James Raymond Carter. The middle name was for her father. She brought him home to a 2-bedroom apartment in East Baltimore, put him in the crib she had assembled herself on a Sunday afternoon, and began the long, extraordinary, unremarkable work of raising a child alone. James Raymond Carter was, by every account of everyone who knew him, the kind of person who made a room feel warmer by being in it. And he was curious and careful and funny in the way that children are funny when they are paying close attention to the world around them and are not yet old enough to pretend they are not. He had Margaret's eyes, deep-set and steady, the kind that look at you as though they are actually thinking about what you are saying rather than simply waiting for their turn to speak. He had, as Margaret would notice with a complicated feeling she would never entirely name, his father's jaw. His father's posture. A certain way of carrying himself that had nothing to do with anything she had taught him and everything to do with biology she could not escape. He grew up in that East Baltimore apartment until he was 9. Margaret worked double shifts when she had to. She studied for her master's degree in nursing administration at a folding table in the kitchen between 10 at night and 2 in the morning after James was asleep. She did not date. And this was not a martyrdom. She was not a woman who made sacrifices and then displayed them for acknowledgement. She simply had no space for it, and no interest in bringing someone into James's life who might not stay. She had already spent 11 months learning what it felt like to be deeply invested in a person who was not entirely who they said they were. She was not interested in a repeat. She bought a small house in a quieter neighborhood when James was 9, and a row house on a tree-lined street with a porch and a yard barely large enough for a lawn chair and a grill, but a yard nonetheless. James learned to ride a bike on that sidewalk. He grew 3 inches in the summer between 5th and 6th grade and came back to school in September looking like a different person, taller and suddenly terrifyingly close to the edge of adolescence. Margaret watched all of it. She was present for every moment of it, and she was aware, in the background of every ordinary day, of the things she was not telling him, the names she had kept from him, the man whose blood ran through her son's veins, and who lived 45 minutes away in a house in Ellicott City with a wife and 2 daughters, and apparently, as Margaret gathered from the occasional piece of information that filtered through mutual acquaintances, a very comfortable life. James asked about his father exactly twice, the first time he was 7 years old. And he was in the back seat of Margaret's car on the way home from a birthday party, and out of what seemed like nowhere, in the completely matter-of-fact way that 7-year-olds ask the questions that adults spend years rehearsing and dreading, he said, "Mom, how come I do not have a dad?" Margaret had prepared for this question. She had rehearsed the answer more times than she could count. She said, "Your father was someone who could not stay. And the most important thing you need to know is that his leaving had nothing to do with you. It was about him and his choices, and they were made before you were born. You did not do anything wrong. You have never done a single thing wrong." James looked out the window for a long moment. Then he said, "Okay," and he went back to looking at the passing streetlights. He did not ask again until he was 16. And by then he was 5'11" and studying for the SATs, and had started staying after school 3 days a week for a debate team that he took far more seriously than his grades in history. He sat down across from Margaret at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening in October, with the specific kind of deliberate calm that teenagers use when they have been rehearsing a conversation of their own, and he said, "Mom, I think I am old enough now. I think I deserve to know. Not what you have told me, all of it." Margaret put down the bowl she had been drying and sat down across from him. And she told him the truth. Not everything. She kept certain things back, the things that she believed were hers to carry and not his, but the essential truth. She told him his father's full name. She told him what he did for a living. She told him where he lived. She told him that the reason she had not told him sooner was not because she was ashamed of any of it, but because she had wanted him to grow into himself first, to know who he was before he went looking for someone else to tell him. James listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not react visibly. When she was finished, he stood up, walked down the hall to his bedroom, and closed the door with the kind of careful quietness that is somehow more loaded than a slam. Margaret sat at the kitchen table for 45 minutes. Then James came back out. His eyes were red at the edges. He sat back down and said, "I love you, Mom, and I am not angry at you. But I think someday I am going to need to find him." Margaret nodded. She said, "I know, and I understand. And when you are ready, I will help you any way I can." James went to Howard University on a partial academic scholarship and a combination of student loans and the trust fund that Daniel Whitmore had set up 22 years earlier and never touched beyond the initial deposit. Margaret did not tell James about the source of that money until he was in his second year of college. It was the last piece of the story she had been carrying, and she handed it over as carefully as you hand over something fragile. James received it with the same measured quiet that had become, by then, one of his most recognizable qualities. He thanked her. He did not immediately go looking for Daniel. He graduated. He got his MBA from Georgetown. He took a position at a real estate investment firm in Washington, D.C., and he was good at it in the way that felt, to Margaret, like watching a piece of something come full circle in a way she had not entirely anticipated. He found Daniel Whitmore when he was 29 years old. It took him less than a week once he decided to look. Daniel was 60 at the time and had, in the intervening decades, built his real estate development company into something substantial. Offices in 3 cities, a portfolio that ran to several $100 million in assets, a second vacation house in the Outer Banks that showed up in a profile in a regional business magazine that James found on the 3rd page of a search. Daniel and Patricia were still married. Their daughters, James's half-sisters, though that word felt strange in his mouth, were both in their 30s and lived in other states. James reached out through an attorney. He identified himself. He provided the documentation Margaret had kept in a fireproof box in her closet for 29 years. The letters, the original agreement, the trust account paperwork, and a DNA test he had arranged quietly and privately through a lab in Maryland. Daniel did not deny it. He was old enough, and perhaps tired enough, to understand that denial would accomplish nothing. The two men met in person exactly once before Daniel died. In a single lunch at a restaurant in downtown Baltimore on a Thursday afternoon in November that James would later describe to Margaret in the kind of sparse, careful language that tells you a person experienced something they are still processing. He said Daniel was smaller than he expected. He said they did not hug. He said Daniel told him he was sorry and that he was proud of what James had become. And that those two things felt true but also insufficient in the way that apologies almost always are when they arrive 29 years after the fact. They parted on terms that were civil and unresolved and honest in the way that only late-life reckonings can be honest, with the weight of everything that cannot be undone acknowledged, but not taken back. Daniel Whitmore died 14 months later, a sudden cardiac event, at home, on a Tuesday evening in the spring. He was 62 years old, and he left no formal will. And that single fact, that absence of a document, that final act of a man who had spent his life making decisions and had somehow never gotten around to writing down the last one, is the detail that changes everything that comes next. Camille Renee Harrison came into James Carter's life at a rooftop charity event in Georgetown on a Thursday evening in October, 18 months after Daniel Whitmore's funeral. She was 31 years old, a wealth management associate at a firm downtown, and she was the kind of woman who understood, with the precision of long practice, exactly how to enter a room. She was polished in every respect. Her clothes were understated and expensive. Her conversation was bright and attentive and perfectly calibrated. She asked questions that made people feel interesting, which is the most underrated social skill in the world and one of the most deliberate. She laughed at the right moments. She remembered details. She followed up. James, who had inherited his mother's ability to pay close attention to people, was charmed by her. And then, which is different, he was impressed. Those two things together, charm and respect, are a combination that is hard to resist. He asked for her number before the evening was over. They dated for 3 months before she told him she was serious about him. She said it plainly, the way she said most things. But without decoration or performance, she said, I am not interested in wasting time, and I think you should know that I am in this. James, who had his own version of that directness, appreciated it. By 6 months, they were spending most weekends together. By 10 months, she had met his colleagues and his closest friends, a small, loyal group of people who had known him since college and who would later tell various versions of the same story, that they liked Camille, that she was impressive, that something about her was slightly difficult to locate. The way a room can be beautiful and carefully decorated and still somehow feel like nobody lives in it. They liked her. They were not entirely sure they knew her. There was one person in James's life who Camille had not met. One conversation he kept delaying in ways that she eventually began to notice, deflecting whenever the subject came up, saying not yet, saying it was complicated, or saying his relationship with his mother was something he was still working through and that he wanted to handle the introduction the right way. Camille listened to all of this with the patience and attentiveness she brought to every situation. And then, privately, she began to do what she had been trained since childhood to do when information was withheld from her. She began to research. And she hired a private investigator in early December, a woman named Sandra Park, who ran a small firm out of an office in Silver Spring, Maryland, and who charged $3,000 for a comprehensive background and asset profile. The report came back in 11 days. Margaret Louise Carter, 61 years old, retired registered nurse, homeowner in Northeast Baltimore. No criminal record, no active litigation. One surviving family member of note, a son, James Raymond Carter, whose name appeared in several public-facing business filings and one mention in a Georgetown alumni feature from 3 years prior. The report was, on the surface, unremarkable. But Camille was thorough. She was the kind of thorough that does not stop at the surface of a thing. She pulled the public probate filings for Daniel Whitmore's estate herself through the online Maryland court record system on a Tuesday night in January while James was at a work dinner. And the estate had been filed in Baltimore County Probate Court the previous spring. The assets were substantial, a portfolio valued at approximately $4.2 million, not including real estate holdings that were still being appraised. Daniel had died without a will, which meant the estate was subject to Maryland's intestate succession laws. Under those laws, a surviving spouse, Patricia Whitmore, was entitled to the first $50,000 and 1/2 of the remaining estate, and the other half would pass to surviving children. Patricia and Daniel's 2 daughters were already named in the probate petition. Their shares were accounted for. What had not been filed, what had not yet been legally asserted, was any claim on behalf of James. James, who was Daniel's biological son. James, who had documentation. James, who had, sitting in his mother's fireproof box in Baltimore, everything a probate attorney would need to file a claim that could, by Camille's calculation, be worth somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million, depending on how the real estate holdings were appraised and how cleanly it was handled. Camille was very good with numbers. She sat with that number for a long time. And here is where the story turns. because what Camille found next was not what she had been looking for, and it changed the shape of everything she had been planning. In the same probate file, buried in an attachment to a motion filed by Patricia Whitmore's attorney in late August, was a letter. It was addressed to the probate court, and it named Margaret Louise Carter as a person whose potential testimony in any heirship proceeding should be treated with scrutiny. The letter alleged, without specific documentation, that Margaret had received funds from Daniel Whitmore over a period of years under arrangements that might, upon examination, constitute a form of financial misrepresentation, the implication being that the trust account she had used to fund James's education might be characterized by the right attorney, with the right framing, as a contractual arrangement that had been improperly concealed from Daniel's legal heirs. It was, in plain language, a threat, a preemptive legal threat designed to discredit Margaret before she could be used as a witness. It had no real legal merit. But in the hands of a good attorney working against a claim, it could create enough noise and delay to exhaust a petitioner's resources and patience. Camille read that letter twice. She printed it. She filed it in a folder she kept in a locked drawer in her home office. And she said nothing to James. She said nothing to James because she was not yet ready to use it, and because she understood, with the cold, a precise intelligence that was both her greatest asset and the truest measure of her character. That information is only valuable when it is deployed at the right moment. She would tell James about his inheritance claim. She would tell him after they were married, after the estate filing window was close enough to create urgency, after she was his wife, which meant that whatever he stood to gain, she stood to gain equally. And if Margaret tried to involve herself in the process, if she tried to testify, to assist, to assert any role in her son's claim, Camille had the letter, she had the threat, she had the leverage. What she did not account for was the possibility that anyone else might be paying attention. The engagement was announced on a Saturday evening in late March. James called Margaret from a restaurant in Georgetown, his voice lighter than she had heard it in months, and told her he had proposed to Camille, and she had said yes. The wedding was set for 10 months out, the following January. Margaret said all the right things. She said she was happy for him. She said she looked forward to finally meeting Camille. She said she hoped he knew how proud she was of the man he had become. Every word was true, and underneath every word was something else, something she could not have named precisely in that moment. In the quiet unease, the way a change in air pressure announces weather before the weather arrives. She met Camille for the first time at a Sunday brunch in late April. James had chosen a restaurant in the Inner Harbor, neutral territory, public, easy to navigate. Camille arrived in a cream-colored blazer and a smile that arrived exactly on time, neither too eager nor too reserved. She said all the right things to Margaret. She asked thoughtful questions about Margaret's nursing career, about the neighborhood where James had grown up, about what James had been like as a child. She laughed in the right places. She touched James's arm with the ease of someone who has practiced appearing comfortable. Margaret watched all of it carefully and said very little that she was actually thinking. The brunch lasted 2 hours. When it was over, Margaret drove home and sat in her car in the driveway for 15 minutes. She was not sure what she had seen, but she was sure she had seen something. Over the summer, the calls from James became less frequent. This was not unusual. He was planning a wedding and managing a demanding job and the ordinary compression of a life getting busy. But Margaret, who had spent 30 years paying close attention to her son, noticed something beyond the frequency. She noticed the quality of the calls. James had always called her in a particular way, with the ease of someone settling into something comfortable, and asking about her week, telling her something small and specific that had happened at work or in the neighborhood or at the gym. The calls that summer were different. They were shorter. They were responsive rather than initiating. He sounded, Margaret would later say, like a man who was monitoring himself, like someone who had learned to choose his words carefully and was not entirely sure why. In September, 6 weeks before the wedding, James called on a Tuesday night at an unusual hour. It was just past 9 o'clock. He said he had been thinking about her. He asked how she was. The call moved through small talk for a few minutes, and then James went quiet in a specific way. Not the comfortable quiet of a conversation that has reached its natural pause, but the loaded quiet of someone working up to something. And then he said, "Mom, I have a question for you. If you ever found out something about someone I love, something that you thought I should know, would you tell me, or would you protect me from it?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. She asked him if there was something specific he was asking her. He said no. He said he was just thinking about things. She said, "I would tell you, always, no matter what it cost me." He said, "Good." And then he changed the subject so deliberately that it felt like a door being closed. Margaret sat with that conversation for a week. She turned it over carefully, the way she turned over anything that felt significant. She asked herself what her son had been trying to tell her and why he had been unable to say it plainly. She asked herself whether she was reading into it, whether she was a mother with a long habit of vigilance, projecting concern onto something ordinary. She considered that possibility seriously, and then she set it aside, because some things you know in a way that lives below reasoning and cannot be argued with. She called a woman named Doris Henderson in the first week of October. Doris was a paralegal who had retired from a Baltimore law firm 3 years earlier after a 30-year career in probate and estate litigation. They had known each other since James was in elementary school, neighbors first, then friends, in the particular way that women in their 40s become friends, through years of shared proximity and small kindnesses that accumulate into trust. Margaret told Doris that she had a question about a probate matter. She said she wanted to understand something about how intestate succession worked in Maryland. She mentioned Daniel Whitmore's name. She mentioned that his estate was still in probate. Doris listened. She asked a few questions. And then she said, "Margaret, give me a couple of days." What Doris found was not particularly difficult to locate if you knew where to look. The probate filing was public record. The letter from Patricia Whitmore's attorney was in the file, and the timeline of the filing was clear. What was less immediately visible, what Doris assembled through a combination of the public file and a phone call to a colleague who still practiced in probate, was the picture of what the letter was designed to do and when. It had been filed in August of the prior year, which meant that whoever had accessed it and known about it had done so at least 12 months before the wedding. And the only person outside the legal parties who would have had reason to be looking at Daniel Whitmore's probate file in connection with James Carter was someone who already knew the connection between James and Daniel, someone who had researched it, someone who had gone looking. On a Thursday morning in the second week of October, 3 weeks before the wedding, a manila envelope arrived in Margaret's mailbox. There was no return address. On the inside was a single document, a copy of a private investigation report commissioned 8 months prior. The subject of the investigation was Margaret Louise Carter. The client information was partially redacted, but the footer of the report bore the name of an investigative firm in Silver Spring, Maryland. Attached to the back of the report with a paperclip was a copy of the letter from Patricia Whitmore's attorney, the one from the probate file. And written in pen at the top of the first page, in handwriting she did not recognize, were 4 words: "Your son does not know." Margaret read the document twice. She set it on the kitchen table. She made a cup of coffee she did not drink. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the October light move across the yard for a long time. She was not angry. Anger would come later. Not the hot, immediate kind, but the slow, structural kind that settles into a person like a change in the weather. What she felt first was something older and more familiar. The same feeling she had felt at 23, sitting on a kitchen floor in East Baltimore after a phone call that had taken 11 months of her life and rearranged it in under 4 minutes. The feeling of understanding, all at once, the shape of the thing she was actually dealing with, the feeling of seeing clearly, and the cold, specific knowledge of what seeing clearly required her to do next. She thought about her son's voice on the phone 3 weeks earlier. "If you ever found out something about someone I love, would you tell me?" She had given him her answer then. Now she would have to give it again, in a different way, in front of 200 people who had not asked for it on the most important morning of her son's life. She called the church. She asked if her seat in the last pew was still reserved. The wedding was set for 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning in January at a historic church in Northwest Washington, D.C. It was an Episcopal church with a vaulted stone ceiling and stained glass windows that threw colored light across the pews in the morning. A building that had been consecrated in 1887 and had the particular kind of stillness inside it that old places of worship carry, and the accumulated quiet of more than a century of people sitting in its pews with the things that mattered most to them. The sanctuary held 240 seats, and every one of them would be filled. Camille's family had come from Atlanta and Charlotte. James's colleagues and his Howard University friends had flown in from 3 time zones. The flowers were white and blush. The program was printed on heavy cream paper with both their names in a typeface that cost more per sheet than Margaret made in an hour when she was 23. Margaret woke at 4:30 that morning. She had not slept much, not from anxiety in the way most people mean anxiety, but from the particular wakefulness of someone who has made a decision and is living now in the long, quiet hours before it becomes real. She made tea. She sat in her chair by the window and watched Baltimore come awake in the January dark. She had her dress laid out, a deep burgundy that she had bought 3 months before any of this had happened, before the envelope in the mailbox, before the phone call, before the shape of everything had shifted. She dressed carefully. She put on the white gloves that had been her mother Gloria's. She wore them on occasions that asked something of her, which was not a thing she had ever said out loud to anyone, but was simply true. She placed the document, the envelope, with the investigation report and the probate letter and the 4 handwritten words, inside her Bible. She called a car service at 8:15. She had not told James she was coming. She had not told him because she was, until the very last possible moment, still deciding whether to act. She had told herself that she would go, and she would sit in the last pew, and she would watch her son walk toward the life he had chosen, and she would make the decision in the room. She trusted herself to know the right thing when she saw it. She had spent 61 years developing that trust. She sat in the back of the car as it moved through the early morning streets of Northwest D.C., and she looked out the window at the January sky, and she asked herself, one final time, whether she was certain, whether what she knew was enough, whether the cost of acting was one she was prepared to pay, and whether the cost of not acting was one her son could afford. She answered both questions before the car stopped. The church was filling when she arrived. She moved through the gathering crowd at the entrance with the quiet purposefulness of a woman who knows exactly where she is going and does not need to announce it. She found the last pew. She sat down. She placed her Bible in her lap with both hands. The organ was playing, something low and measured, a processional prelude that the guests were still arriving over, still finding their programs, still greeting each other with the particular brightness of people dressed for celebration. Margaret looked at none of it. She looked at the front of the church, and she waited. The groomsmen filed in. James's best man, a man named Kevin who had been his roommate at Howard for 3 years, took his position at the front. And then James came through the side door. He was in a dark navy suit. He moved with the ease of someone who has practiced being comfortable in formal situations, but Margaret, who had been watching her son walk into rooms his entire life, saw that something underneath the ease was not easy. He stood at the altar. He spoke briefly to Kevin. He adjusted his cufflinks once, which was a thing he did when he was trying to collect himself, and a habit he had had since he was 12 years old, and it still meant the same thing it had always meant. And then he turned, and he scanned the church, and his eyes found the last pew. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It was long enough. James looked at his mother in her burgundy dress with her white gloves and her Bible, sitting in the very last row of a church she had never been invited to by the woman who was about to become his wife. And something in his face. Not relief exactly. Not quite that word, but something adjacent to it. Something in the neighborhood of being found. Shifted in a way that only Margaret would have recognized and only Margaret would have understood. She held up the Bible. Just slightly. Just enough. And James gave her the smallest nod that a human head is capable of giving. And then he turned back to face the altar. The processional began at 11 o'clock exactly. The Camille's bridesmaids came first, 4 women in blush dresses moving in the measured, self-conscious way of people who have been told to look natural while doing something deliberate. Then the flower girl, 6 years old, scattering petals with the focused intensity of a professional. Then the doors at the back of the church opened wide and Camille appeared and the congregation stood. She was, from a distance, everything the occasion asked for. The dress was extraordinary, ivory and structured, and with a long train and a veil that caught the colored light from the stained glass windows as she moved. She walked with the confidence of a woman who had imagined this moment and was now inhabiting it precisely as she had planned. Her eyes moved over the congregation with the practiced warmth of a person who has learned to make a crowd feel personally regarded. And then, at the back of the church, her eyes passed over the last pew. Camille's expression did not change. And that was what Margaret noticed. Not the smallest flicker. Not the adjustment that a genuinely surprised person makes. Nothing. The eyes moved on, and in that absence, in that controlled, deliberate nothing, Margaret understood everything she had come here to understand. This was not a woman who had not expected her. This was a woman who had expected her and had already decided what to do about it. The ceremony was, for its first 20 minutes, perfect. Perfect in the way that things are perfect when they have been planned with sufficient resources and sufficient care. The readings were well chosen. The voices of the vocalists filled the stone vault of the ceiling with something that genuinely moved people. The officiant spoke about love and commitment with the ease of a man who had done this many times and still believed in it. James stood at the altar with his hands clasped in front of him. And if you did not know him, you would not have seen anything in his face but the appropriate solemnity of a man about to be married. Margaret saw something else. She saw her son holding himself very still in the way you hold yourself still when you are waiting for something. The officiant was a man named Reverend Thomas, white-haired and measured, with wire-rimmed glasses and the particular gravity of someone whose entire professional life has been organized around moments that matter. He had been Camille's family's minister in Atlanta for years before relocating to the D.C. area. He moved through the ceremony with unhurried precision. The vows were exchanged, first Camille's and then James's, each of them speaking in clear voices that carried to the back of the church. James said the words as if he meant them, which Margaret believed he did, which was part of what made all of this so painful. He had no reason to doubt what he was saying. And he did not yet know what Margaret knew. Reverend Thomas paused after the vows. He looked out at the congregation with a brief, encompassing sweep of his gaze. He said, in the formal language that has been part of Christian marriage ceremonies for centuries, the language that was written into the liturgy precisely because the people who wrote it understood that a community gathers around a marriage not only to witness it, but to stand behind it. And that standing behind something requires knowing the truth of it. He said, "If anyone here knows of any reason why these two people should not be joined in marriage, let them speak now or forever. Hold their peace." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Margaret counted them. She had been counting them in her head for 3 weeks, running the moment over and over the way you run something over when you are trying to understand its weight before you have to carry it. She looked at James. He had not moved. His hands were still clasped. His eyes were forward, but in the very last moment, in the 4th second, he turned his head, just slightly, as if he was listening for something. Margaret stood up. The sound a church makes when a person stands in the last pew during a ceremony is a particular sound, not loud, not dramatic in itself, but carrying the way sounds carry in stone rooms, multiplied and directed and impossible to ignore. Heads turned. The heads at the back turned first, and then, in a ripple that moved toward the front of the church, the heads in the middle, and then the front turned too. Camille turned last. Margaret was standing with the Bible in both hands in front of her, shoulders back, chin level, in the way her mother Gloria had stood when she wanted the world to understand that she was not moving. She looked at the front of the church, and she said nothing yet. She waited for the room to be completely still. And when it was, when the last whisper had died, and the last program had stopped rustling, and the last person had finished turning, she spoke. She said, "My name is Margaret Louise Carter. I am this man's mother. I am sorry to do this here, and I would not do it if I had any other choice. But my son needs to read something before he signs a legal document in this room today, and he needs to read it now, while he still has the freedom to make a fully informed decision about his own life." She held up the Bible. She said, "James, I have something for you." And then she sat back down, closed her hands in her lap, and waited. 240 people in a stone church, and for a moment, a long, suspended moment, not one of them made a sound. And then James moved. He turned away from the altar and walked down the aisle toward his mother, and the sound of his footsteps on the stone floor was the only sound in the building. He reached her. She stood and held out the Bible. He opened to the place where the envelope was tucked. He took it. He removed the document. He read it standing there at the back of the church, with everyone watching, with his best man and his groomsmen and his guests and Camille and Reverend Thomas all watching, and he read it with the same careful stillness that had always been his most characteristic quality, the ability to receive information without allowing it to move him until he was ready to be moved. When he finished, he looked up, and his eyes were wet at the outer corners. He folded the document. He put it back in the envelope. He looked at his mother for a long moment with an expression that she would describe later to Doris as the most honest thing she had ever seen on a human face. Not gratitude, not anger, not grief exactly, but the face of someone who has just understood something they had been trying not to see and has found, on the other side of seeing it, that they are still standing. He said very quietly, and so that only she could hear, "I think I have known something was off for months. I just did not want it to be true." She said, "I know." He said, "Thank you." She said, "I am sorry it happened this way." He said, "Do not be." Then James turned and walked back toward the front of the church. He stopped halfway down the aisle. Then he looked at Camille for a long moment. Long enough for Camille to understand that whatever she had calculated and planned and controlled was no longer the structure she was standing in. Her expression in that moment was described later by 3 separate guests in 3 separate conversations as the look of someone whose plan has reached its final page and found the ending wrong. James said, in a voice that was quiet but carried in the stone building the way everything carried, that he needed some time. He said the ceremony was not going to continue today. He thanked everyone for being there. He said he was sorry. He walked to his mother and offered her his arm. And the two of them walked out of the church together, through the doors, and into the January morning. In the months that followed, a Baltimore probate attorney filed a formal heirship petition on James Carter's behalf. The documentation was thorough. The original correspondence, the trust account records, the DNA profile, a sworn affidavit from Margaret. Patricia Whitmore's attorney raised the fraud allegation in a responsive filing. It was reviewed by the court and dismissed within 6 weeks for lack of supporting evidence. James was awarded a share of Daniel Whitmore's estate that, after fees and the resolution of the real estate holdings, totaled just under $940,000. He used a portion of it to pay off Margaret's house. The rest he invested. He did not discuss this publicly. He was, in that way, very much his mother's son. Camille Renee Harrison moved back to Atlanta in the spring. There were no legal proceedings against her. She had, in the legal sense, done nothing that rose to a prosecutable act. She had withheld information. But she had used a private investigator. She had filed a legal document that turned out to have no merit. The assessment of what it is, morally, humanly, in the accounting that we all make of people's choices, belongs to whoever is doing the accounting. James and Margaret spent Christmas together that year for the first time in several years. They cooked at her house on the east side of Baltimore, at the table where James had first told her he was old enough to know the truth. And they sat together for a long time after the meal, the way people sit together when they have stopped needing to fill the silence. At some point in the evening, James said, not as a statement, not as a conclusion, just as a thing that had arrived in him and needed somewhere to go, he said, "You know, I think I understood the whole time growing up that you were carrying something. I did not know what it was. I just knew it was heavy. And I always wondered why you did not put it down." She said, I did put it down, eventually. He said, "I know. I was there. There is a question underneath every story like this one. It is not the obvious question, not who did the right thing, not who was the villain, not who won. Those questions have answers, and the answers in this case are not complicated. The question underneath is harder. It is the question of what it costs a person to carry something true and heavy and important for as long as it needs to be carried, and in what it means, what it actually means in the lived experience of a human life, to do it without complaint, without recognition, without any guarantee that the moment you finally put it down will be the right moment or the safe moment or the moment anyone will understand. Margaret Carter spent 27 years as the only person who knew the full shape of her son's story. She carried it through double shifts and sleepless nights and graduations she attended from the back row and a brunch in the inner harbor where she sat across from a woman who had investigated her and said all the right things and watched her carefully and felt nothing. She carried it until the morning when carrying it had become the same thing as failing the person she had carried it for. And then she stood up. In the last pew of a stone church in January with a Bible in her hands and 200 people watching. And she said the true thing, and then she sat back down. That is not a dramatic act. That is not a movie act. That is the act of a person who understood, as her father had told her at a kitchen table in East Baltimore 30 years before, that your name is all you have when everything else is gone. Your name and your word. And the two things are the same. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone, or something you have carried, or someone who carried something for you, leave a comment below. Tell me who this story made you think of. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me whatever this brought up for you. I read every single one. This is the Narrative Echo. Stories that stay with you. Subscribe and come back for the next one.